Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, June 17th, and over the weekend we had not super compelling finals games between the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals, but we did have two blowouts in Game 4 from teams that needed to keep their series alive and are looking to build on that to pull off the improbable comeback. So we are going to dive into both the Mavericks fighting back to dominate the Celtics in Game 4 and whether or not there is anything for them to build on from there to be the first team in NBA history ever to come back down 0-3, and the Edmonton Oilers, who put up a historic performance, winning 8-1 against the Florida Panthers. So we're going to be diving into both of those series as well as some MLB headlines from the Dodgers, who dealt with a couple massive injuries over the weekend and sort of how that played out, what their season looks like from here, and additionally the Boston Red Sox, who have just been floating around mediocrity all year long, just pulled off two really big series wins against rivals and are in the playoff picture despite what feels like has been a very underwhelming season, and yet they could make the playoffs. So we're going to dive into whether or not Red Sox fans should feel confident with where their team is at. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can leave a tip or donation at gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a comment, it will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Anything would be greatly appreciated on that front. I was actually in Boston on Friday for a watch party to see if the Celtics could bring home banner number 18, and it was a really charged atmosphere across the entire city. Lines for going into these various bars were 100 people deep by 6 o'clock in the evening, and the energy very quickly shifted as the Mavericks just absolutely destroyed the Celtics in this game. The first quarter is where you could start to see things look really shaky for the Celtics, but in the back of your mind, you could think about how Game 3, it followed a very similar point where the Mavericks took a quick 10-point lead, but it was the Celtics' response to that showed that that was probably their game for the taking, and that response just never came in this game. And it was obviously a sense of, you could see the difference in urgency between these two teams, where the Mavericks, trailing 0-3 in the series, basically had no choice but to leave it all out there on the line, and especially with the fact that it was basically, the national media just ragging on Luka Doncic for 48 hours in between these games. You knew that he was going to be a better version of himself. I really did think that the level of effort on defense was greatly improved from Game 3 to Game 4. Now, again, we've seen this with Luka in the past of when he stops complaining and such. How long is that actually going to last for? Is he going to stay committed to it? But it was definitely encouraging to see from Luka. Obviously, some of the foul baiting is still there. It's just a part of his game. It's not necessarily a knock if it's in the rule books. He's going to be one of the best players in the league to take advantage of it. And especially, Xavier Tillman, when he's getting minutes, he had a shooting foul against Luka on the three-point line. Not sure how much more Tillman we are going to see. But overall, Luka's effort was really important for the Mavericks, and I thought that the most impressive / important thing for the Mavericks in this game was the offensive rebounding, where they had 13 in this game, 7 of which from Derek Lively, who has been very quiet in this series up to this point, and he was one of the big developmental pieces that allowed them to make the finals run because of how active he was on the boards and the connection that he was having with the lobs with Luka and Kyrie. He was getting easy dunks at the rim, spacing out the floor a little bit, at least from the perspective of in the pick and roll game, forcing these centers into difficult positions. And Lively overall was excellent in this game, something that the Mavericks are going to need to continue on here, and especially with Kristaps Porzingis still out through these past couple games. Sounds like he's going to have a similar role moving forward here for whatever that means. Shams Charania reported that earlier today, that if he is needed, it's sort of the break glass in case of emergency situation with Porzingis, and I don't think that bodes very well for whether or not the Celtics would actually use him. It was clear from Friday that they were never intending to use him. Maybe things are a little bit different Game 5 at home, but ultimately I don't expect to see very much of him tonight. So the Mavericks are going to have some sort of a size advantage here, where the Celtics are matching these smaller players up against the bigs of Dallas. And very briefly on that note, Daniel Gafford only 10 minutes in this game, actually just under, for whatever it's worth. But interesting to see the way that the Mavericks, and obviously there was the entire, quarter and a half was all garbage time, but Jason Kidd just isn't really trusting Daniel Gafford the way he was earlier in the postseason. Curious to see if that does come around by any means. When we talk about offensive rebounds, he still, just his presence was felt, at least on that offensive rebound and the putback that he had, the and one, I believe it was, against Payton Pritchard. I forget if he actually hit the shot or not, or if it was just that he drew the foul. But, regardless, that's something that the Mavericks should look to continue to build on. And this is an area where I feel like the Celtics have been beatable, where Tatum, who was the only semblance of offense for the Celtics really in this game, he had his 11 points in the first quarter, obviously finished with 15 in the game. So outside of that, again, this was non-competitive for basically the entirety of it. But you did see moments where Tatum was pretty lackadaisical trying to box out these Dallas bigs, and that's where the Mavs ended up grabbing 4 in the first quarter. They out-rebounded the Celtics by 10 in the quarter as a whole, and understandably, he needs to take on, he's been guarding the bigs all series long. This isn't some sort of an adjustment for him. He just needs to be more focused in that area for this upcoming game. But this is a situation where the Celtics have been a pretty good rebounding team, especially through the playoffs, but they've looked vulnerable against bigger teams on a number of instances throughout the regular season. And that's something that it hasn't hurt them up to this point, because you look at the teams that they played in the playoffs, they were missing a little bit of size. That's where I think the Jarrett Allen mismatch could have provided some sort of a different look for the Celtics. Not that I ever thought the Cavaliers were going to beat the Celtics in the second round, but at the same time, at least, providing that overwhelming size mismatch, especially with Porzingis out, could have been something interesting. So that's definitely something that I feel that the Mavericks need to continue to lock into, is controlling the glass. And on the other end of this, as much as it was the Mavericks, and you have to credit Luka for the defense that he played, and that the Mavericks were so much more active than the Celtics, Boston also just couldn't really hit anything. They shot just 30%, I believe it was, in the first half, scored 35 points. That is the lowest scoring half under Joe Mazzulla in these past 2 seasons since he's taken over as head coach. And they were still getting a number of open three-point looks, I thought. They had a number of layups that should have gone in. And, for whatever it's worth, we've been giving him a ton of praise throughout the postseason. And he's been great. He's been one of the main factors for the Celtics getting here. But Jrue Holiday, this was very possibly his worst game as a Celtic through this entire season. He did have 10 points, but the 5 turnovers and the fact that it was just, he was kind of just letting the ball slip out of his hands on these layups where he got a number of very possible looks at the rim. Couldn't convert there. Some of the turnovers were just so sloppy where he was just dropping the ball out of bounds and such. He ended up with a plus-minus of -38. And this is a stat that I think gets thrown around, sort of too often. There's a ton of extra context that goes into these numbers traditionally. But just as a fact, -38 is the lowest plus-minus in a finals game since the inception of the stat. I believe it was in the 90s that they came up with it. So a really rough game for Jrue Holiday. Jaylen Brown had a pretty weird game himself where he ended up 3 of 12 from the field. And again, I thought that there were a number of open shots that these players were getting. By the way, Derek White, as much as he has been, again, another one of these great glue guys for the Celtics team, he struggled again from 3. And, he's had some big shots in the past couple rounds. But since that heater that he was on against the Miami Heat in the first round, he has not been himself from a three-point shooting perspective. That's something that feels like, law of averages could bounce back around at some point. But also, the Celtics team is just, they haven't shot well yet in this series, which is something where you probably feel like they are going to be okay because they get one hot three-point shooting night, and that is probably it for the Mavericks. But again, at the same time, they are playing a risky game going on this long without actually being able to knock down their threes. And again, I do feel like the quality of their shots has been there, but it's just been uncharacteristically bad shooting. But that being said, the Mavericks did basically everything they needed to do in this Game 4 to at least try and instill some hope in themselves and their fan base. And the fact that, by the way, don't want to dive into it too much, the fact that the Game 5 wasn't last night when there was, practically nothing going on seems very strange to me from the... at least, I don't know. I understand there was travel in there and whatnot, but felt like it would have been a great opportunity last night to have this game. But instead, Game 5 is tonight in Boston. And the question is there anything that the Mavericks can take out of that game to build off of? We already mentioned the rebounding. That's something that I've been talking about throughout the entire series. They need to do a better job there, or at least sort of replicate what they did at least on Friday. Luka, he needs to stay locked in. Obviously, it's great when you are up by as much as you are. You don't have to worry about the refs at that point. But coming back to Boston, the emotions of playing on the road, and for that note as well, Kyrie finally needs to sort of have a Kyrie-esque performance in Boston. Kyrie was good. He wasn't even necessarily elite, and the Mavericks were still able to blow out the Celtics on Friday. If he can go out and put up a good game in Boston, I think it makes all the difference for the Mavericks. And additionally, one that is sort of smaller and probably doesn't mean anything, but it is interesting seeing Tim Hardaway Jr. And listen, I've made jokes as well with ESPN sort of fixating on him so much, but in this game, he had gone just about a month without scoring. It was Game 6 against the Oklahoma City Thunder in the conference semifinals was the last time he scored. That game was May 18th, so, Friday, June 14th, that's the amount of time that was in between him scoring in a game. But he came in garbage time, and he was red hot from 3, 5 of 7 from the three-point line in 12 minutes. I understand. Chances are they are probably not going to be playing him heavy minutes. He may not get any time at all, so there's a very good chance I'm sort of wasting my time talking this out here. But it is interesting when you're in a shooting slump as long as you are, and in a game scenario, you get to see some start to fall through. Now, you're going to be on the road. We know the at least reputation of role players play better at home than they do on the road. So it may be hard for Tim Hardaway Jr. to make the transition back into Boston, but at the same time, he's one of the veteran guys for whatever it's worth at 32 years old on this Mavericks team. Just throwing it out there that it could be interesting to see if he was able to build up some sort of level of confidence that could translate to the game. Honestly, chances are probably not. But if we do see Tim Hardaway Jr. be able to turn himself around, I think that it is because of what he got himself into on Friday, seemingly finding his three-point shot. But we'll see. Obviously, the role players are going to play a massive part of this series moving forward. You're going to need the stars for Boston to show up in a way that they absolutely did not during Game 4. And on that note, there were some interesting comments made from a number of Celtics over the weekend in regards to having this type of a series lead and navigating the pressure. Very, very lackadaisical for a lot of these Celtics players that seem to think that losing isn't the end of the world. So we are going to dive into sort of some of these comments that were made and whether or not it is a sign of the Celtics playing this a little too loose. But before we do that, we have to go to a quick break. We will be right back. Don't go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, no, this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news if it's some loose shit. A stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we pick up here talking about the NBA Finals, and there were some interesting comments made from the Celtics over the weekend about the current situation that they're in. Now, the first couple of quotes that came across my timeline were from Sam Hauser and Payton Pritchard, where Hauser said, quote, "It would be awesome to get it done. It would be great in regards to winning Game 5. But, quote, if we do lose, it's not like it's the end of the world. We'd still be up 3-2. And then Payton Pritchard similarly made a comment of, we really want to win the next game, but if we don't, it's not the end of the world. We have 3 more rounds to go. So, interesting that first off, and at this point we're talking about a couple role players, obviously guys that are in the rotation for the Celtics, but these guys speaking out loud using the same terminology. And then we had Jayson Tatum make very similar comments as well, saying that for the Celtics, losing Game 5 isn't the end of the world, and how much that they would really like to go out and win it at home. And Sam Hauser added to his quote as well that it would be special to win at home. But the fact that, you have these guys that are all it's clear the fact that the Tatum quote exactly was, we would love to win tomorrow. He was asked about this on Sunday, but if it doesn't happen, it's not the end of the world. So that's 3 players saying the same thing, it's not the end of the world. So to me, I at least interpret that as this is clearly a conversation that they've all had, that this is a little bit of a shared perspective amongst the team. If, they're all using the exact same terms, essentially. And it does feel like there's been a little bit of an energy shift from after game 3, where they were saying more so of the right things, where I believe Jaylen Brown specifically said the job isn't done yet, as much as it's nice being up 3-0. And Jayson Tatum added to the fact that in the 2023 playoffs, the Celtics were down 0-3 to the Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals, and that he and the team felt like if Tatum didn't roll his ankle in the first minute or two of that Game 7 matchup, that they would have been the first team to ever pull off the comeback. So it's interesting depending on how you want to interpret all of this, because at the end of the day, it's not the worst thing in the world that the Celtics are currently feeling some level of calmness to it, that it is almost business as usual, and that they're not overreacting to what was an absolutely abysmal loss on Friday, where it was abysmal in terms of their performance. Ultimately, again, like all the things we highlighted during that first segment, we talked about the fact that it's just a very clear difference in desperation between the Mavericks and the Celtics, given the scenarios that baked into that Game 4 matchup. When it was in Dallas, they had everything to lose. The Celtics, I wouldn't say quite nothing to lose, but to some degree as well, they were never going to feel the same level of urgency as the Mavericks were feeling in that matchup. So, it's good that the Celtics aren't overreacting, and it doesn't seem like they're going to change their approach, because ultimately I do feel like, outside of making sure to work a little bit harder on the glass, not allowing the Mavericks to have these second chance opportunities, they just missed their open looks. And the fact that they turned the ball over definitely too much in this game as well, which is something we didn't highlight earlier in the recap. But a lot of what they have done to this point is why they feel like they can win this game. And that's included in the fact that they haven't had their hot three-point shooting game yet, which feels like it should be coming at some point. Now, it's interesting, the longer this goes on, the more you do sort of question whether or not it is going to, come into play. But ultimately, the Celtics shouldn't overreact to one game where they have lost just 3 games in, call it almost 4 full rounds. Obviously, still have to finish this one off, but they've been incredible during the entire regular season, and so far in the postseason, it has been a pretty dominant showing for them. So they shouldn't be looking to change everything, but again, the fact that they're all talking out publicly about how it's not that big of a deal if they end up losing this game is interesting. I just don't know why you necessarily put yourself into that position. Now, obviously, you're being asked questions from the media. You are going to answer them. But it just feels a little bit strange, I feel like, to come out to the public and sort of be so nonchalant about the way that the rest of this series can go. And it sort of makes me think about the fact that Joe Mazzulla, of course, the head coach of the Boston Celtics, he's a pretty interesting guy, where obviously, if you've seen any of his interviews, he's got his own sort of unorthodox, you could say, mannerisms and such, but I do feel like he has continued to improve as a coach, from the fact that just flat out he was nowhere near as good last season as he is this year. So he's grown a bunch, but it's interesting to see, the way that he has some of his philosophies and such. And a quote that it feels like some of the Celtics players sort of poke at him a little bit for is this idea that he has reiterated on a number of times, which is the closer you are to winning, the closer you are to losing. And the interpretation of that is that the more comfortable you are because of being up in a series, the more you sort of lose your focus and you become more vulnerable to lose. And that's something that Mazzulla was talking about a little bit as well during game 3, where the Celtics ended up building up this 21-point fourth quarter lead and almost, letting it completely slip through up until Luka ends up fouling out. So you can definitely make an argument that this could very easily be an even series. And even if you go to game 2, I thought that there were a lot of opportunities for the Mavericks to win that game as well. And ultimately here, for the Celtics, it's just extremely important for them, especially for this team, that ultimately, again, they have been in this position of sorts on the bigger stages, second time in the finals, but have been to the Eastern Conference Finals in 6 of the last 8 years, where they understand the idea of pressure from the media, from the fans, all of it. And I just feel like it's kind of setting themselves up for a level of scrutiny a little bit, just being, again, so sort of dismissive of the pressure that's currently surrounding them. And again, you want to play loose. You don't want to, tighten up and end up hurting yourself in that sense. We saw the Golden State Warriors when they beat the Celtics in the 2022 finals after they were down in a series, and they were pretty much unbothered by the Celtics going up 2-1 in that series. They were laughing, joking around at shoot-arounds, and they were just mentally the more experienced, more mature team for the instance. And also, I feel that the Celtics are just a better team than the Mavericks, that ultimately, if talent is going to play out here. Now, Luka's the best player in the series, which is why it does sort of also feel like, if Tatum were seen to be in that top 3 grouping, that it would be something where you feel like, okay, Tatum's just going to have one of those games and lift the team. It doesn't really feel like he is on that, absolute, one tier, where he is a little bit more towards the second tier of really, really incredible players, all NBA caliber players, making first teams and such. But it's not quite as easy for him to necessarily elevate the Celtics to where he can just get to his spots. He can, get hot from 3, and he can get hot from 3, but we have seen the efficiency this season, and especially in the playoffs so far, just be really poor for him. And it seems a little bit unrealistic to expect him to turn it around. It's one thing, it's very much possible, conceivable, that he could, at least for a game or 2, or maybe even, more, 3 to be specific, but of him to get hot from the 3-point line and be able to will the Celtics. We've seen it from him in the past. Game 7 against the 76ers last year, putting up 51 in 2022. Game 6 against the Bucks on the road, when that was one of his best performances of his career. So it's again, something that is very much a possibility, but to expect him to do that is unrealistic in my eyes. And it just makes for an interesting conversation over the Celtics team of, especially when they don't seem to be taking it quite as seriously in the public, and that's the thing, is it's all about the public and what they are physically saying to reporters, knowing that it's going to get aggregated and such, that it is just really interesting to see how they have chosen to go about this. But at the same time, you still have the quotes from Tatum that he just said, it was either this morning or it was yesterday, about the idea of winning finals MVP. And he's, listed a number of players who, NBA greats more specifically, that were on all-time incredible teams and didn't end up winning finals MVP. That he expects them to be back for the future. It would be nice to win finals MVP on the biggest stage, but at the same time, winning the finals is the priority right now. So ultimately, I do feel like the maturity of Tatum and Brown and this overall team has shown enough to be reliable, but at the same time, I just thought it was very interesting, some of the comments that they made. But let me know in the comments section if you feel any differently. But we have, as much as this NBA Finals, again, it's a lot of intrigue within a 3-0 series lead, sparked by a massive Game 4 performance from the team that needed it. We have a very similar script going on in the NHL, with the Edmonton Oilers having a dominant win against the Florida Panthers over the weekend to keep their season alive. So we're going to be diving into all of the Game 4 action and where that series goes from here. But first, we are going to be taking a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we move on here to the NHL and the Stanley Cup Finals, where we saw the Edmonton Oilers dismantle the Florida Panthers on Saturday night, winning their Game 4 matchup in an astounding 8-1 game, which leads to some speculation over whether or not we could see a potential comeback. Now, in this game, I think that it's important to consider all of the same factors we talked about during the NBA Finals, where it was just one team, who was holding a 3-0 series lead, deep on the road, even more so than in any other, Stanley Cup Finals or NBA Finals ever, where however many miles it is between Edmonton and Florida, where the Panthers were deep on the road and felt like they were potentially going to be celebrating with a win in this game, and it just seemed like the Oilers were playing with far more desperation in this game, where they were able to just sort of catch Bobrovsky on an uncharacteristically soft night, where it started with the shorthand goal from Matthias Janmark. I believe that's his second of the postseason, where we are still seeing this power play for Edmonton really struggle, you could say, for the majority of the past 2 rounds in general. I know that they turned it on a little bit at the end of the Western Conference Finals against the Stars, but for the most part, their power play has been largely ineffective, and at least in this instance, they didn't need that, where Janmark, again, getting out on the break from a pass from Connor Brown, scores a shorthanded goal to at least disrupt what Bobrovsky was sort of cooking over the past couple games, and they just continued to pour it on from there. Ended up going into the second period with a 3-1 lead. They then once again get on Bobrovsky again early, finally seeing some level of production from the top of their lineup, where headed into this game we had seen 0 goals combined from the top 5 goal scorers of Edmonton through the postseason, where Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Evan Bouchard, Zach Hyman, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, none of them had scored yet. Goal, that is, at least. McDavid with a number of assists, and he just passed Gretzky for, I want to say it's the most assists in a single postseason run at like 30-something. So that just further goes to show the legacy of McDavid, it's not easy to ever break a Gretzky record, and that's what McDavid has been able to do from a playmaking standpoint, but he also gets finally in the scorers category with the goal that he had early on in the second period. And then we saw later in the period as well, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins also get on the board. But by that point, we had already seen Bobrovsky get pulled. Just 5 minutes into the second period, the front runner for the Conn Smythe Award, he had been pulled out of the game. It was interesting. I was literally just before they ended up pulling him, it was a Darnell Nurse goal. And I think that, I was asking at that point, is it something that makes sense for the Panthers to just kind of wave the white flag and not get Bobrovsky off of his rhythm anymore? And that was ultimately the decision they tried to go with. So they end up pulling him just before the 15-minute mark in the second period, and from that point, it was never really a competition. So it's definitely a feel-good win for the Oilers, where it was their first win in the Stanley Cup Finals. Was 2006, if I'm remembering off of the top of my head. Was the last time that they had a win in the Stanley Cup Finals. So it was great to see for that organization and for that crowd especially as well, because we've talked about how electrifying the Edmonton crowd has been throughout the entirety of this postseason. And, it eventually was getting charged up during the third period of Game 3, but at that point, the Oilers had already put themselves into some sort of a hole that was just too much to overcome. So ultimately, this was the feel-good game for them. And now, just like in the NBA Finals, we start to talk ourselves into, well, is there anything that the Oilers can look to build on moving forward here, and do they have any chance? Now, unlike in the NBA and the NHL, we have seen a number of different series come back from 0-3 deficits. I believe 4 series in the NHL, including one in the Stanley Cup Finals as well. Now we're talking 1940s by that point anyways, so we are at a very different point in what the history of the NHL looks like and what the current landscape is and such. But it is something to at least keep in mind there, that the Oilers are not necessarily going into this entirely, uncharted area. And what's going to start for them is they're going to have to try and break Sergei Bobrovsky. And I don't know if that's necessarily possible. Maybe this was the start of that, possibly getting some cracks in the armor there in terms of Bobrovsky and the Panthers and how shut down it's been. You are going to, it feels like, get breakaway opportunities against the Florida defense, for as smothering as they are, like we saw on the shorthanded goal from Janmark. It's these instances where the forecheck is also just so aggressive for Florida in the offensive zone that occasionally you can sort of squeak through, and if you have that good passing from the back line, you are able to generate some types of opportunities. And the majority of the goals allowed by Bobrovsky up to this point have come on the break. So that's something that, again, it's very difficult to try and push the pace against Florida's defense, but it's something that I feel like to some degree as well, you have to try and do. You also look at the way that Florida on the back end of their defense are just so good at getting their sticks to deflect passes and shots, and one of the best shot blocking teams in the NHL, that's absolutely something that they are going to need to have going for them. I thought this was an incredibly impressive performance from Stuart Skinner, who, again, I keep saying, I have not been I haven't been a number one believer of him by any means. I think that the difference in the goaltending between Bobrovsky and Skinner was the number one reason why I picked the Panthers to win this series, but he was incredible in this game, and there was a chance that this could have felt like a lot more of a game when the Panthers got a 2-on-1 breakaway and Stuart Skinner made that save going from his right to his left, going up and making the glove save, something that we have seen him struggle with up to this point in the postseason. That was sort of a really defining moment for him of, this is our game. We are going to take this, energize the crowd, and ultimately, it set the tone for the rest of the game. Oilers went on. They did end up scoring on the power play finally. I believe it was their first time in the entirety of this final series, where the Panthers were going on a stretch of killing 45 of 47. I believe that was coming into this game. That might have been after the first penalty kill. But we had seen this Panthers penalty kill on an absolute heater, and finally the Oilers were able to break through. Now, again, at this point, not even against Bobrovsky, so they're going to feel like that they can come back composed. And ultimately, I thought that despite the fact that this was obviously a very ugly game, if you're looking for any sort of a silver lining, if you're a Panthers fan, other than the fact that your team is up 3-0, it's the fact that this was obviously a very ugly game on the ice from a performance standpoint, but the Panthers didn't necessarily unravel at the first opportunity. You saw Bobrovsky come out. He seemed very composed still necessarily. In the third period, where the Oilers were pouring it on them, they were still able to, again, keep their composure. We've seen a lot of cheap hits throughout this series, especially with some of these knee-to-knee contact instances throughout at least the first three games. And the Panthers just, again, were able to remain calm, let this game just sort of pass them by, and they feel like they are going to have a golden opportunity to win this thing at home. I believe Game 5 takes place tomorrow night. So Panthers are favored in that one, minus 135 according to ESPN Bet as things currently stand. So it's hard to, again, overreact if you're a Panthers fan. An extremely ugly game, very possibly the worst of the Panthers' whole season, but they were able to put themselves in this opportunity of having a little bit more leeway. Now, you had those sort of moments of thinking, oh, well, are we going to be celebrating, partying tonight for winning this championship? The first in Florida Panthers history for that note, so obviously they know the pressure that's sort of on the line there, but ultimately, they had that moment. They came up short. Now is the time to sort of refocus your energy. Make sure that you aren't going into this offseason with regrets. We've talked at length before about how the Panthers feel like this is all about their unfinished business. So that's where their mind currently is. And I personally, I'm not going to sway off of the picking the Panthers. Now, am I going to say it's definitively over? I probably don't have the same level of confidence in that as I do with the Celtics being up against the Mavericks. But the Panthers are the better team in my eyes, and they just need to close it out in one of these games. We've seen Bobrovsky in the Eastern Conference Finals be able to stand on his head and put the team on his back. So I anticipate that that's how this is going to play out. But if you think that the Oilers are going to make a comeback, definitely let us know why in the comment section. But we're going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be getting into some more MLB action from a couple of the top storylines over the weekend, starting with the injuries to both two star players for the Los Angeles Dodgers and how that will impact their season moving forward. So stick with us and we will get into all of that after this quick break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be moving on to some MLB news, where over the weekend we saw a couple really devastating injuries take place for the Los Angeles Dodgers. They were facing off against the Kansas City Royals in a weekend series, and it definitely took a toll on the team. Now, ultimately, they were able to still win 2 out of the 3 games, so from that perspective, they were, able to hold up for themselves, but definitely a different outlook moving forward here for the Dodgers, as they saw injuries to 2 of their top players in Yoshinobu Yamamoto and Mookie Betts. So Yamamoto's injury took place on Saturday when he was pulled out of his start after just 2 innings. Yamamoto was dealing with some type of fatigue headed into this matchup, where earlier in the week we saw his start that was supposed to be on Thursday get pushed back, so it was clear the Dodgers pitching staff felt like they needed to give him a little bit more rest. He was working off of 4 consecutive starts of 100 or more pitches. It was, if I'm not mistaken, the first time in his MLB career. Obviously came over from Japan in the offseason, playing his first year here in America and in the MLB. But when you look at Yamamoto and how he's been going this season so far, and you look at the game log, he pitched a career-high 106 pitches in his most recent start leading into Saturday. That is at least 106 pitches against the New York Yankees, but had yet to hit 100 total through his early MLB career, and 4 straight games of 100 or more. So it was clear, from the perspective of his body, that he needed to sort of rest up a little bit more. They gave him those extra few days, but it was clear that something was still wrong. He had to tell his translator to communicate to the team after the second inning that he was really struggling with pain, and his performance on the field didn't necessarily indicate that. Just 1 hit and 1 walk over those 2 innings, but he ends up coming out of that game. The Dodgers end up losing the game, but more importantly, it is being currently classified as a rotator cuff injury. Now, we're at the point in the season where we're coming up on midway through the year. The Dodgers now at this point are, closing in on game number 81, and we've seen a number of pitching injuries occur over the past week or so, where it's Yamamoto, Justin Verlander as well, Kyle Bradish, all of these guys, for whatever different issue, are going down on the IL. Now, for Yamamoto, this is not seen as a season-ending injury, which is a huge win for the Dodgers, who last year we saw plenty of instances, not just with injuries, but some off-the-field stuff as well. Going to more so focus on the injuries of just not having their top-end guys when the playoffs came around. And obviously, I think just as big of a part of that in the postseason last year, when they ended up getting swept by the Diamondbacks, was the fact that their offense was just non-existent. Their top guys, and Mookie and Freddie Freeman, neither one of them really performed at any level, offensively at least. So, it's going to be, the point being though, that they saw plenty of pitching injuries last season. They're hoping that they just can have their guys available at the right time, as awesome of a season as Yamamoto has had up to this point, and it's been really encouraging. If you look at his stats across the board, he has a 2.92 ERA, a 1.068 WHIP, 0.7 home runs per 9, 10.2 strikeouts per 9. Everything has looked very solid for him up to this point, and very encouraging in terms of, the upside of him being able to be a, prime pitcher for them when the postseason comes around. But got to actually be available when the playoffs are here. So ultimately, Dave Roberts, their manager, said that he's going to not be throwing for at least 2 weeks, and we'll see what the situation sort of plays out there. From there, we don't necessarily have a defined timeline as of yet, but probably something that they're just going to, I would imagine, again, based off of their experience last year, try and, keep Yamamoto as comfortable as possible moving forward here, not rush him back. And it helps the fact that the Dodgers currently are the best team in the National League, or second best team, I should say, behind the Phillies, who did just drop a series over the end of last week. But Dodgers sitting at 44-29. They have a pretty commanding lead over their division as things currently stand in the NL West. Padres are 8 games behind. So again, the Dodgers, they're going to try and be as careful as possible with these injuries, including the fact that Mookie Betts got hurt over the weekend as well. He was the leader in the MVP race according to DraftKings. I believe he was entering the weekend somewhere around plus 125. And on Sunday, he got hit by a pitch on his wrist. He went down, was sort of sprawled out on the ground, looked really concerning. Now, he is going to very likely be put on the IL within the next 24-48 hours. They're calling it a fractured bone in his wrist. No surgery is required, which is the big win for Dodgers fans and baseball fans in general who want to see Mookie out there, because it likely means this is another non-season ending injury. And ultimately, it's still a huge bummer, of course, but knowing that it's not going to cost him and the Dodgers the rest of the year is at least very encouraging. It's a huge loss still, considering the fact that Mookie has, been phenomenal, and he holds 2 very important roles for the Dodgers in both being their primary shortstop and being their leadoff hitter as well. So we don't know what the full timeline is going to look like. Again, late summer is probably what I would expect, just purely off of speculation here. I think that he should be back for the playoffs, but again, we don't necessarily have the entirety of the timeline available to us just yet. But it does make it interesting, through the combination of his injury and Yamamoto, in terms of what the Dodgers are going to do as the trade deadline approaches, how aggressive they'll choose to be. They did just pick up Kevin Biggio for, whatever it's worth. Biggio is being, he's had a tough year for himself overall, for somebody who was once seen as a very promising player for the Blue Jays. Is hitting, I think, in total here this season just 200, and has been, again, just not up to the standards of what we were sort of expecting him to be. And so that's somebody that they can at least throw out there, but they're going to need more reinforcements. I would probably expect that they are going to avoid going the starting pitcher route. I think that they will be confident in who they have at the top of their rotation when the playoffs come around. But in terms of maybe adding some arms, I mean, listen, every team can add arms in their bullpen at the end of the day, but just having some players that can sort of help platoon and sub in for a lot of the production that Mookie provides there. Some defense as well at shortstop, because Gavin Lux was supposed to be their shortstop headed into the year, but he got moved to second base because he was struggling some in spring training. I'm curious whether they decide to try and roll him back out there at shortstop, or if he at this point is just comfortable enough at second base that they want to keep him there and try and find some sort of other option there on the open market, at least until Mookie comes back. But going to be really interesting to see how they choose to approach this. And listen, I think that the National League, for the most part, is wide open, where you're looking at, 4 teams as things currently stand that are 500 or are above 500. It's the Phillies, the Braves, the Brewers, and the Dodgers are the only 4 teams in the entire National League that have a record above 500. Now, you got a lot of teams that are just sort of hovering in the picture and could potentially make a playoff push, but it's where the Dodgers probably feel pretty confident about where they're at right now. I would imagine they would like to, build themselves up a little bit more in terms of playoff seeding if they could find their way to number 1. I kind of have a hard time, especially with these injuries, imagining that they are going to surpass the Phillies. But, all in all here, I think that things could have been a lot worse for the Dodgers based off of having your 2 top players go down literally within one day of one another. But ultimately, I don't think the level of concern should be all too high. If you disagree, let us know why in the comments section. But I did just mention the Philadelphia Phillies, who are coming off of a loss to a Red Sox team, and then ended up losing the 2 straight series losses now between them and the Baltimore Orioles over the weekend, and the Boston Red Sox, who the Red Sox now 2 straight series wins for themselves against some prominent teams, the best of both conferences in the Phillies and the New York Yankees. So we are going to be taking a quick break here, and when we come back on the other side, analyzing where the Red Sox are at and whether or not their fans should be happy with where things currently stand. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. As for our final segment of the day, we're going to be diving into a conversation around the Boston Red Sox, who are coming off of the win of the season when they took down the New York Yankees last night in a 9-3 win at Fenway Park. It seems like for the Celtics, or for the Red Sox that is, it has been definitely an underwhelming excitement season. Now, part of that is because the Celtics are cruising to the NBA Finals. Their ownership group is investing all of this money into their team. And then from the Red Sox perspective, John Henry is making comments about how he views the Red Sox as an asset, and that the Fenway Sports Group doesn't typically sell assets. Just makes it feel like this is all just a money-making business opportunity for them, which it is, of course. All of these are, but at this point, it feels like there is definitely a real reluctance from the Fenway Sports Group to really invest into this team, and it feels like this is just about the exact position that the ownership group would like to be, where they aren't spending very much money on the team's payroll. They're down from the previous season, and yet they are 37-35. They're in the mix of everything here, just a few games out of the final wild card spot. So they're sitting 37-35. The Twins are 40-32, 3 games ahead of them. The Royals are another half game ahead of that, but the Red Sox are absolutely in this conversation, which is what it's felt like for the past couple years now, where the Red Sox were on a very similar trajectory of being in the conversation of making the playoffs, feeling like, well, just waiting on a couple injuries, a couple players to come back from their injuries, and then they can start legitimately putting a run together. And for me personally, as a Red Sox fan, I've definitely had a real hesitation of buying into this team being for one thing, like, I would just like to see, and I feel like in the MLB in general, just make the playoffs, and just make the playoffs. But that enough is a win. You can't get swept up in, well, if you make it, how good are you actually going to compete? We just saw the Diamondbacks come out of a wild card appearance, and same with the Rangers as well. Both wild card teams making their way to the World Series. Just make the dance and see what happens from there. So I feel like the bar is a little bit lower maybe in the MLB, where crazy things happen. Players get hot, pitchers get hot, and I think that ultimately, the goal is just make it and see what happens from there. And the Red Sox absolutely have all of the assets that if they wanted to, they could go out and buy during the deadline. I just don't anticipate that's what's going to happen. And ultimately here, when you are talking about the Red Sox and you look at, they are in this conversation, one of the biggest reasons I have my reservations is the fact that up to this point, obviously coming off of 2 big series wins against the Phillies and the Yankees, they are still just 13-23 against teams over 500. So it is hard to imagine that, they are going to be able to keep up this sort of a pace. Now, their expected win-loss record is actually better than what they currently sit at, and the Twins is worse. So again, it's further sort of thought process of this team can find a way to, put themselves in a playoff contending position and see what happens from there. And that's obviously what I'm rooting for. I just really struggle to believe that this Red Sox team is necessarily worth investing into from an emotional standpoint, because this has been ultimately, and if I sound like a massive complainer, the fact that the Red Sox are 37-35 right now is so much better than the projections were coming into the year, and this has been a massive revelation. Now you're seeing a little bit of a tail off, but the starting pitching and rotation has been unbelievable for the Red Sox this year, despite not necessarily having any star aces out there. Brian Bayo, their big contract extension from the offseason, he's been struggling and regressing a little bit this season. Now, it's not over for him by any means, but you're not really getting the production you would expect out of him. It's a Tanner Houck, who is legitimately in the conversation for American League Cy Young. Now, the fact that Garrett Cole has been out for the entirety of the season definitely helps that. We haven't really seen an AL Cy Young race quite as open as it currently is in a number of years, also considering the fact that Shohei Ohtani is out of the American League as well. So, it feels like there are a lot of individual player things to be rooting for. And this is sort of the approach that the Red Sox were operating under when they had Chaim Bloom as their president of baseball operations, was the fact that they were building up for this next wave of star talent where you have a Ceddanne Rafaela who know his overall batting average isn't necessarily incredible, and there have been some tough swings along the way, you could sort of make it out to be, but he's also been just incredible of driving runners in. 39 RBIs. That's something that in years past we've seen with this Red Sox team. Once they get sort of those top end guys of the lineup on base, there was nobody else to drive them in. But Rafaela's been really impressive. Connor Wong is having a massive year, especially considering the fact that it doesn't matter how much longer we get away from the Mookie Betts deal. It still feels like, especially anytime they are on national television, it has to be brought up what their return was, and not being all that much. And listen, I understand also part of that this past weekend at least was baked into the fact that Alex Verdugo is now on the Yankees. He was one of the bigger pieces in return there for Mookie Betts in, when they made the deal in 2019, or 2019, 2020, whatever it was, 2020, I believe. But, ultimately it's interesting, but we still see Connor Wong, who is having a good season, and the return's never going to be enough. We know that, but, it feels at least good as a Red Sox fan that we're not sitting here a couple years later with absolutely nothing out of that deal. And again, just, you're sitting around waiting on Tristan Casas coming back from his injury. Wilyer Abreu was having a Rookie of the Year candidate type year for the majority of the season. Now he's dealing with his injury, and you feel like you get a couple of these guys back, then all of a sudden, there's a potential push to be made, because I don't believe by any means that the Royals or Twins are these untouchable forces in the American League. The Royals are very much sort of reliant on the very top of their lineup, kind of like what we were alluding to with the Red Sox of the past, and there's a ton of promise there as well. I've had a lot of fun watching the Royals this season, and to some degree I'm rooting for them over the Red Sox, because I still have hesitancy with this Red Sox ownership group, where I don't like that they end up benefiting and being rewarded for their lack of investment into the team. But, Twins, too, are just another team that I don't necessarily feel incredible about. And it just seems like it's going to be shaping up into another season where the Red Sox hover around 500 for the majority of it and then fall off. And it's awesome having these moments to root for when you take down the Phillies and the Yankees, and you're on national television. I had some of my Yankees friends at the game over the weekend, Saturday specifically, that were starting out by giving me a little bit of BS, and then ultimately the Sox end up winning this one, and they're able to hit Rodon around a little bit. So, I think that ultimately at the end of the day for the Red Sox, again, I understand it's been ultimately a positive season, but for how Red Sox fans should feel, I still don't think it's good necessarily, because I don't know, maybe we see some level of an increased spending from the Red Sox over the next handful of years. The young talent is only going to continue to come up. Marcelo Mayer, now that he is healthy in the minor leagues, one of the top prospects in baseball. He could be a massive part of their infield for years to come. Roman Anthony has been one of the most up-and-coming prospects over the past year or so. Kyle Teal as well, who they drafted in 2023, I believe was the draft that they took him. So all of these different players that could be a part of the long-term roster, you feel like all they would really need is to buy into some level of pitching, in the way that Andrew Bailey has been able to sort of reconstruct the approach of that entire staff has been massively impressive to help them get to the point where they currently are. let alone, when you start to actually go out and get some top-end talent as opposed to just relying on, for whatever it's worth, not that they're bad players by any means, but you're, leaning on a Cutter Crawford or a Nick Pavetta and just some of these, they're middle of the rotation guys. They're still waiting for the ace. And I mean, if Tanner Houck is going to continue to pitch like this, as a Red Sox fan, you take that any day, but it's hard to imagine that he is going to, become this perennial guy, even though I did always have a little bit of hope that he could, at least be number 3 starting pitcher in the rotation. And even if that's the case, you still take that as a Red Sox fan. But again, it's a lot of conflicting opinions because it feels like we've just been here for the past 2-3 years and that you are waiting for something to change and it's just a lot of the same. And again, ultimately not the worst results in the world, but not necessarily, for whatever it's worth, living up to the expectations, especially when on the other side of the city you have Wyc Grousbeck and the Celtics ownership group putting out more money than basically anybody else in the entire NBA. And John Henry treating this as a fun side project in terms of just a way to make money. But let me know in the comments section whether or not you feel like I'm off base here. As you can tell, I'm a little bit worn out from the repetitive nature of what these Red Sox seasons have felt like. But at the same time, I'm still going to watch them, still going to root for them, but with a little bit of a grain of salt. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Reminder, we are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, so we will be back tomorrow. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.